When the Golden Age gave way to the Silver Age, the world began to change, and there are many reasons for this. But one of the key reasons I tell you now. You see, back in those days, fruit in the forests was abundant. People could wander into the woods, they could wander down into the valleys, they could wander up even into the mountains themselves, and they could pluck fruit from here and fruit from there. They could gather vegetables growing upon the ground and find enough to fill their bellies, enough indeed to have leftover food in surplus, to place upon the sacred altars of the gods and give them food in thanks for the abundance of food in the world. There was no real need in that day and age to do anything that might resemble such a thing as work. But in this day and age, when humans were wandering hither and yon, filling their bellies at their leisure, others were thinking other thoughts, darker thoughts, stranger thoughts, and one of the beings thinking thus was the lord of the underworld himself, Hades. He had ruled the dead for thousands upon thousands of years. But he had ruled the dead alone. And there is only a certain period of time you can do things by yourself. And it's all well and good people talking about the joys of independence and solitude and carving your own way in life, but that's all so much waffle at the end of the day. For as days roll into weeks, weeks to months, months to years, years to decades, decades to centuries, centuries to millennia, the loneliness becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. And you realize that some things you do not want to do alone. It's not that you can't do them, it's that you don't want to do them. There are some burdens that are better shared with a loved one. And Hades yearned to have a queen sit upon the throne beside him in the land of the dead. And he cast his eyes about the world, not about his own kingdom, for it would not have been fitting for him to marry a shade, to rule over the shades of the dead. Rather, he wanted to marry a living being. It was more, not a mere human, you understand, not a mere mortal, but a goddess. And as he cast his eyes about the world, one day they alighted upon the figure of Kore, young and beautiful and lithe and full of joy, full of the energies of the spring, dancing amongst the flowers, calling to her mother Demeter, who sat upon her throne watching with great indulgence her daughter frolic and play. And Kore was everything that Hades dreamed of. She was not only beautiful, but funny and kind and gentle and witty and charming. She was joyful, and he was a man, a god, who had, well, gone an awfully long time without knowing joy. For if your duty, your job in existence, is to look after the grieving, the despairing, the bereaved, how much joy can you truly feel yourself in your own heart? Very little. And he went, Hades, to Zeus, king of the gods, and said to Zeus, I wish to take a wife, I wish to take a queen, and Kore is that queen. And Zeus, in his lordly way, without thinking of consulting with the mother of the chosen bride, gave his consent. If she is willing to have you, you may have her, you may be married, my brother, he said, and I shall have for myself a new sister-in-law. And so Hades, without further ado, went down, down, down into the underworld. And there he mounted his chariot, his horses, put about him his cloak, his helm of invisibility upon his head. He took spear, he took sword, he dressed himself magnificently, despite the fact that he was going to be invisible, but he wanted to look his best whilst not being seen at all. And up he galloped into the land of the living, bursting out of the earth, creating a huge crater behind him. And there was Kore, dancing and frolicking, full of life, full of happiness, full of innocence, unaware of the invisible presence around her. She saw the shower of earth cluttering to the ground from the great crater that had exploded, but she could not see the cause of it. And, shocked, surprised, she stood and watched in wonder, trying to work out, had something fallen from the sky? Had something exploded upwards from the earth? What had happened? And whilst she was looking and wondering, Hades strode across, grabbed her in his beefy arms, threw her over his shoulder, got back upon his chariot, and descended back down the way he had come, with her kicking and screaming, horrified and surprised to be levitated up in the air by a force she could not see. She could feel his arms, she could feel his cloak, she could beat against his back, and she was aware that there was something there, but she couldn't see what. And as the chariot and its two passengers and the horses went back down into the underworld, the rocks, the boulders, the earth that had been thrown up in a crater were drawn back to fill and plug the hole. And as they descended deeper and deeper, the earth above them settled, and no one would have known there had ever been a crater there. They were gone. And for poor old Kore, poor young Kore, it was not until they arrived in the palace of the king of the dead itself that she was allowed to dismount the chariot. She couldn't even see, although she could hear the wheels clattering upon the cobblestone. She could hear the horses' hooves. She could hear them whinnying and snorting. She could hear the clomp clomp of the shoes of Hades. And it was only when he took off his helmet of invisibility and took off his cloak that she could actually see who had taken her. And despite what you may see in some rather silly films, Hades is a magnificently handsome man, forceful and charismatic and dynamic, not perhaps the most tactful of men, for when death comes to seize, it takes what it wants there and then, with very little thought for tact or diplomacy or patience or any of those finer virtues of social life. And Hades is a little used to getting what he wants when he wants it. But, well, there was a tremendous relief in the heart of Kore that this being who had whisked her away from the land of flowers and sunshine into this land of gloom and coldness and dankness beneath the earth was not the monster she had been envisioning. She had imagined something with fangs and drool and slather and 3 heads and tentacles and Lord knows what else. But here was a handsome, charming man. And he put his interest to her. That he had watched her, he had loved her from afar, that he wanted a queen to rule by his side. And she, for her part, was not unflattered to be thought of as prospective queenly material, but she was certainly far from pleased to be whisked away in so brusque a fashion, to be dragged beneath the earth without so much as a hello, goodbye, or how's your father, although there was plenty of that to come. Down into the depths she had been taken, without any consultation, without even a chance to say goodbye to her poor old mother. And as she thought of her poor old mother up in the land of the living, Demeter realized that, as she emerged from her doze in the summer sun, she could not hear the laughter of her daughter, singing, dancing, playing, wandering amongst the woods, and she went looking for her. calling here and calling there, and after some 10-15 minutes she began to become a little concerned. Perhaps it was a game, perhaps Kore was hiding behind a tree playing hide-and-seek. She had done that often enough in the past, and so Demeter allayed her fears a little more and went on searching a little more, calling a little louder and a little louder, and half an hour had gone past without any kind of giggles or suppressed sniggers from the woods that she had experienced in previous games of hide-and-seek, and she realised that maybe something was amiss. 1 hour, half hour rolled into 1 hour, rolled into several hours, and Demeter became more and more frantic in her searches, more and more distraught, tearing apart the woods, calling, crying, sobbing, yanking at her hair, tearing at her clothes, scratching at her face in her anxiety, until the blood began to run and spatter. She searched and she searched and she searched. 9 days and 9 nights she wandered further and further and further afield, and in her wanderings she forgot all about the many duties of a goddess. The fruits of the trees, the grains of the field, the vegetables of the earth were forgotten, were not tended to, and in the heat of the sun they began to shrivel, without the goddess to keep them fresh and vital and alive. And people began to notice when they went out, mere mortals, to pluck their fruit and their vegetables and their grain from the land, that it was looking less and less appetizing with each day that passed. And the cries of Demeter were loud. I mean, she was a goddess after all, with the lungs of a goddess. They echoed across the lands. They echoed all the way up to the high heavens, all the way up to Olympus itself, and troubled the gods, troubled humanity, who had no idea what it was that was howling and crying and making such baleful noises. But they could hear it, they could feel it in their hearts. The women of the earth found themselves weeping unconsolably and unaccountably whenever they heard these feminine cries echoing across the lands, thinking of their own children, thinking of their own loved ones, and how they would feel if their children disappeared, if their loved ones vanished. That they felt overwhelmed with grief, and no one thought to put all food upon the altars of the gods, because, well, the women were too laden down with grief, and the men were too worried about the women in their lives to be thinking about gathering offerings to leave upon altars. And so at length the word reached the gods, and the gods discussed amongst themselves what they should do. And it was Hecate, goddess of the moon, goddess of strange dark places, goddess most ancient, a goddess who predated the other gods, for she was Titan as much as Olympian. She came down and met with Demeter and said to her, "I did not see what happened to your daughter, for I was elsewhere at the time, but I heard it. I heard her gasps, her cries, I heard the thundering of hooves upon the ground, I heard the turning of chariot wheels, I heard an explosion of the earth flying up, and I heard an implosion of the earth flying back down. And then there was silence, except, of course, because Hecate has a foot in 3 worlds, in the world of mortals, in the world of the gods, and in the underworld. She, and she alone, could hear the chariot wheels and the horses' hooves and the calls and the cries for help of young Kore going down, down, down into the lands of the dead. And so Hecate said, "I fear that is where your daughter must have been taken." And Demeter wept and wailed, thinking her daughter dead. Why else would she be in the land of the dead, unless she herself were dead? And Hecate pointed out that if she were dead, there would be a body, and there was no body. And so Demeter was a little ameliorated by that, but only a little. For, as is the case with all thinking beings, what we do not know for a fact we imagine, and so often our imaginations are worse than the reality. And Demeter certainly began to imagine horrible, awful, dreadful fates that might have befallen her daughter. And the 9 days and 9 nights turned into more and more and more days and nights, and the crops and the fruits became more and more neglected. They withered, they shriveled, they died, they rotted. There was virtually nothing for people to eat, virtually nothing for them to keep themselves alive, let alone place upon the altars of the gods. And of course the lack of offerings to the gods led to the gods becoming as hungry as mere mortals were becoming. And amongst themselves they said something must be done, but even as they said it, something was being done. For at the behest of the grieving mother, Hecate had agreed, as the goddess who crosses 3 worlds, that she would descend down and down and down and down into the land of the dead and search and search and search until she found what had become of young Kore. And whilst this was going on, Demeter did not simply sit and wait. She continued to search, not wholly convinced that her daughter was down, thinking that she still might be somewhere in this middle world of mortal beings. And her searches brought her to the land of Eleusis. And there, overhearing the gossip of mere mortals, she began to think that maybe there was something strange happening in the court of the king and queen of Eleusis, and could that something strange be connected to the fate of her daughter? She didn't know, but she wanted to know. And of course a goddess cannot simply walk into the court of kings and queens, or for that matter into the hovels of peasants. For if mere mortals clap eyes upon the gods and goddesses in their true form, they will explode, disintegrate into ashes. So the gods have to disguise themselves in ways that mortals can see, without suffering terrible consequences. And so Demeter took on the shape of a somewhat down-at-heel old woman, a nursemaid. And she went into the palace of the queen, using her divine powers to brush aside the guards that would otherwise have stopped her. And walking into the palace of the queen, she introduced herself, not by her goddessly name, but as a mere humble nursemaid, and said to the queen, I hear, my dear, from the people of Eleusis that your children are not well. And this was indeed the case. The queen, who was beside herself for her own griefs about her own children, explained that she had 2 sons, Demeter and Triptolemus, and that neither of them were doing terribly well. They were suffering from various ailments and illnesses, just infants themselves. And physicians had been sent for, and special diets had been tried, and medications had been tried, but still they grew more sickly and more sickly and more sickly. A terrible thing it was, and she didn't know what to do. "Ah, my majesty, my good woman, allow me to tend to your children, for I have been tending to children for many, many years. And I know their ailments, and I know their ways, and I will look after them and nurse them back to health." And there was just something about this strange old woman that the queen, not able to quite put her finger on it, nonetheless felt safe and felt comfortable with. And so, without even really knowing why herself, she invited the strange old woman to take up the post of nursemaid. And whilst Hecate was going deeper and deeper into the levels of the underworld, searching in this cave and searching in that cave, searching down this dark tunnel and up that dark tunnel, so in the world of mere mortals, the magical old nursemaid looked at the two boys. She looked at Demephon, who was the sicklier of the two, and alone in the nursery, I say alone, just herself and the two babies, none of the other people of the palace around to interfere or disrupt. The old woman took out her breast, and whilst had she been a genuine old woman, she would not have had any milk to feed the infant with. Of course, being a goddess, she had as much milk as she chose, and so she suckled young Demephon at her breast for 3 days and for 3 nights, and such was the magical power of the milk of the goddess that Demephon was restored to absolute health, glowingly healthy. In fact, he went on to become a great and wondrous hero. And she was easily able to restore Triptolemus to health with just 1 day's worth of breastfeeding, and thinking him maybe a little short-changed compared to his brother, having had 1 day compared to 3, she decided, for lack of anything else to do, whilst she was trying to find her daughter, and all of the time she was asking people in the palace, had they seen this, had they seen that, trying to find information that might be relevant to the fate of Kore. She began to work her magic on Triptolemus. Each night she would hold him above a sacred fire, a fire that she had produced, not an ordinary fire, but a magical fire, and it would burn away the shades of mortality, leaving him immortal. But one of the servants passing the door looked in and spied this, and in a panic ran to the queen and said, "Oh, my queen, that mad old woman, she's trying to burn the babies." And the queen, of course, beside herself, ran through the palace in a panic, burst into the nursery and said, "Oh, what are you doing? What are you doing? Stop, stop!" The old woman was pulled away from the fire. The baby was pulled away from the fire, and so the spell was broken. And the old woman stood, and in a voice that bespoke a goddess, she explained to the queen the terrible mistake that she had made, that in disrupting this ceremony of fire, she had denied her son immortality. He would be stronger than most other people, braver, wiser, bolder. He would be blessed by the amount of fire he had already been held in, but he, alas, although capable of living much longer than most ordinary mortals, would one day grow old and die. And the queen wept and wailed at this, the loss of the gift that the goddess was trying to give to her son. But done is done, interrupted is interrupted, and so the baby, blessed but not immortal, was returned to its crib. And the old nursemaid wandered off on her way, heavy-hearted, not only heavy-hearted at the loss of her daughter, but heavy-hearted at her failure to complete her set task of granting these wondrous gifts to both of the two young brothers. And she went sadder and sadder and sadder with every footstep towards the cave, and withdrew into the darkness of the cave, despairing of ever finding her daughter, despairing of ever being reunited with Kore. And she wept and she wept and she wept, and the more she wept, the more shriveled and neglected and desiccated the fruit and the crops became in the land. The hotter and hotter and hotter the sun got, burning away all greenery, and the hungrier and hungrier people became. And the hungrier and hungrier the gods became for lack of offerings. And whilst she wept, Hecate journeyed deeper and deeper and deeper until she arrived at the palace of Hades himself. And there she heard tell that Hades had, well, not quite a wife yet, for the wedding had yet to take place, but a bride-to-be, and instantly she knew what must have happened. And so she entered into the palace of the king of the land of the dead. And whilst she was entering into the palace of the king of the land of the dead, up in the land of mortals, the gods, besides themselves, with the wailing and crying of humanity, and indeed not just humanity, of all of the other species of herbivores who were suffering for the lack of fruit and grains and vegetables, and indeed the carnivores who were suffering for the lack of herbivores to eat, for many of them had themselves shriveled up and died in the heat and from hunger as a result of what was befalling the land, looked around at their foregathered throng. Hecate was gone on a mission, and she was the wisest of the wise, and they wondered what they could do to lure Demeter out of the cave. And each of the gods, each of the goddesses, suggested some scheme in turn, all terribly clever, but Zeus said, no, that won't work. No, that's too complicated, that's too involved. That won't work. What can we do? What can we do? And eventually, one of the most humble beings in Olympus, Baubo, came forth and said, I know what I can do. Now, a mere handmaiden of Olympus, she went down to the land of mortals and found the cave in which Demeter was sitting and weeping. And whilst in the land of the dead, Hecate was negotiating terms with Hades and his bride-to-be, Baubo gathered some musicians around her. She put bells on her wrists and bells on her ankles, and as the musicians began to play, she danced outside the cave. She whipped off her top and jiggled her boobs at the goddess within the cave, who looked the other way and pretended not to see anything and retreated even deeper into the darkness of the cave. And Baubo began to sing along with the music, the most bawdiest, rudest lyrics you could possibly imagine about every conceivable sexual act you could possibly dream of, and some you probably wouldn't really want to dream of without therapy afterwards. The song got... the sort of thing that would have made Bernard Manning blush. It was so saucy. And when all of that, the lyrics and the boob flashing failed, well, Baubo, not one to be outdone, resorted to her final joke. She lifted up her skirts and flashed her nether regions at the goddess, who turned round and burst out laughing in sheer horror to see such a sight, as she jiggled her front parts and jiggled her rear parts and jiggled any other parts she could find to jiggle, all of the while singing and dancing and gyrating and leaping and turning. And, well, once Demeter had started laughing, she found she couldn't stop. She laughed and she laughed and she laughed until the tears flowed down her, and she came out of the cave where she had been sat all of that time, scratching at herself, tearing at what was left of her clothing, ripping out her hair by the roots, and she was covered in rips and tears and scratch marks and looking like she'd fallen through a rose bush backwards. And even as she stagged out, laughing and guffawing and her whole body shaking, bits of blood dripped here and dripped there and dripped everywhere, and where the blood spattered upon the land, plants emerged from the blood spatters and opened their brilliant red petals to reveal the first poppies that grew upon the land, born of the grief of a mourning goddess who had seemingly lost her child for evermore. And whilst the goddess was laughing and laughing and laughing till the tears ran down her sides and she was fit to burst and almost aching, almost painful with the laughter, Somnos, one of the other minor deities, gathered up the seeds of the poppy and ground them and ground them and ground them and made a potion that would induce sleep. And this he passed to Demeter, whose throat was so sore from laughing like a hyena that she gratefully tipped this sweetened nectar down her throat. And not only did it ease the soreness of her throat, but of course it put her into the deepest, deepest sleep. And the land continued to suffer whilst she slept, but the gods were able to work upon the problem. Hecate returned to Olympus with a negotiation deal, which was that Hades was prepared to allow Kore to return to her mother. And if she returned to her mother, she was free to either stay there forever, or if she decided to return to him voluntarily, she was free to do that too. But Hecate pointed out, causing all of the smiles of relief on the faces of the gods and goddesses of Olympus to fix where they were. If Kore has eaten any of the food of the land of the dead, then she must stay in the underworld. And of course the gods knew that that would mean Demeter's grief would be everlasting and all things would shrivel and die upon the planet. And the gods agreed to this, or what other choice did they have? And they sent Hecate back down into the underworld to deliver the agreement, signed and sealed, a great scroll with the names, the signatures of the gods and goddesses upon it. And she presented this to Hades and said, the gods have agreed to this. Now, Kore, have you eaten any of the fruit of the underworld? Now, when Hecate had first left to carry the deal up to Olympus, Kore had not eaten any of the fruits of the underworld. But in the short space of time that Hecate had been in Olympus, putting the proposals to the gods, getting them to sign the agreement, whether knowingly, whether tricked into it by her husband, whether unwittingly just out of hunger and boredom, for she had been there for quite some time, and she, like all of the gods in the world above, was getting hungry for lack of offerings. Whatever the reason for doing it, she had seen a pomegranate split open and laid succulent, dripping with red juices, fragrant, in a bowl of gold. And hunger, temptation, boredom, who knows what it might have been, had got the better of her, and she had reached out and she had taken up half the pomegranate and eaten a few of the seeds. And of course the pomegranate is the food of the dead. And she admitted to this. What else could she do but tell the truth upon the matter? For Hecate sees all truth. And her husband-to-be at once leapt up and rod and said, she must stay with me. She has eaten the food of the dead. She cannot return to the land of the living. She must always have one foot in the land of Hades, as indeed you do, Hecate, have one foot in the land of Hades. And Hecate said, if she does not return, then Demeter, her mother, will grieve and grieve and grieve until all green and growing things are dead. And then all of the animals, including humankind, that feed upon the green and the growing will die too. And yes, Hades, your kingdom will be filled with all of the living beings that are currently upon the earth, but there will be no future generations to take their place in the land above, or to swell your ranks in the land down here. Now, will you settle for all living beings presently upon the planet, or Do you wish to see the green and the growing once more return? That the living beings above may survive and survive and survive, and have generation after generation after generation who will live and grow and flourish and die and come to you, and who in the time of their living and growing and flourishing will make offerings to you and to Kore and to the gods of Olympus? Or do you wish all of that gone in a generation? And Hades could see he had somewhat painted himself into a corner with his move that seemed so clever that it would give him short-term gains but long-term losses. But a deal is a deal. And they ummed and they ahed and they ahed and they ummed, and at length, and it may have been Hecate herself or it may have been Kore who suggested it. It was so long ago, nobody can quite remember who first suggested it. But the idea was mooted that just as Hecate moves between Olympus and the land of mortals and the land of the dead, so perhaps Kore could move between three worlds. She could spend some time with her husband-to-be in the land of the dead, and she could spend some time with her mother in the land of mortals, and maybe even nip up to Olympus every now and then for a visit with the gods. And to this Hades agreed, for he would have his beloved on the throne beside him for a part of the year at least. But even though he might be lonely and bereft in that portion of the year when she was up visiting her mother, at least he knew that his mother-in-law would be happy and joyful and bring the green and growing things to the land, that the living beings would continue to flourish generation after generation, continue to make offerings generation after generation, and that he would never run out of offerings and never run out of dead people to join his ranks. And so the deal was sealed, and the wedding was held between Hades and Kore. Now, whether Demeter herself attended that wedding, I do not know, for I'm not old enough to have been on the guest list. I feel it, but I'm not old enough to have been on the guest list to be there present to know quite who attended the wedding of the year. But having married Hades, Kore, as women do when they marry, changed her name and became instead Persephone, queen of the land of Hades. And so for part of the year she is Persephone in the lands of the dead, and for another part of the year she is Kore up visiting her mother in the lands of the mortal. And when she is visiting her mother is joyful and happy and content, and the plants grow and people eat and are fulfilled, and the animals of the world eat and are fulfilled, and all is good and all is great. But when the goddess descends back to be with her husband, Demeter goes into mourning. She retreats into her cave, albeit for a short period of time. And the lands of Greece grow hotter and hotter and hotter, and so arid that all green growing things wither and shrivel and die. And of course, it might have been the case that humans and other animals would also wither and die for lack of food, but for the fact that when she had been holding young Triptolemus over the fires, one of the queen's two sons, not only did she grant him all sorts of blessings, but she granted him the blessing of wisdom, and part of the wisdom that she granted him was the wisdom of agriculture, the knowledge of how to grow crops, how to plant orchards, how to reap the green and growing things, not only grow them but store them afterwards, so that in those periods of the year when the land becomes unbearably hot in Greece or unbearably cold in Britain, and nothing much is growing, that the wise farmers of the world have food stored up, preserved, ready to keep them going during the harsh months. And as Triptolemus grew and grew and grew, and like most half-divine beings, he grew at an alarming rate, he was able to wander the world, teaching the people of the various lands of Greece and further afield how to sow seeds, how to tend fields and orchards, how to grow vineyards, how to store the crops and the fruits of the land and keep themselves going through the harsh months. And so the gifts of Demeter not only are given by her own hand, but given through those to whom she has shown matronage and kindness and compassion. And much joy may they be to her during the months when she is with her daughter once again. Thank you.